We're back for our last lecture of the semester. Welcome. We'll move a little bit on into globalization and its effects, and we'll leave off with wrapping the whole course up. So we talked a little bit about what globalization is, and this graph really demonstrates to you, the larger circle being the entire world's economy, and we know it's interconnected, right? The next slides will show you a little bit about how interconnected it is, but we also know that certain countries play a larger role in that global economy and therefore can exert their will throughout the world. This isn't necessarily new, right? Great Britain had one of the world's largest economies during the colonial era, as did France. And Great Britain and France could exert their will both within their own colonies, but could also pull the strings elsewhere. But it's nothing like the world today. The United States, for example, which has the world's largest economy, can use its economic power to influence other nations who rely heavily on imports and exports to and from the United States. In fact, if any of you kind of follow the news today, the trade war that's going on between the United States and China is very much a war about whose economy is going to dominate the world's global economy in the future. China has a growing economy. The United States stagnates a little bit, but is still the world's largest, but is threatened to be taken over by China. And so people within the United States, especially people in the current administration, are, at least in their imagination, threatening to kind of downsize China's economy in order to keep the American economy as the world's largest. And, that's about imports and exports. There's also a lot of domestic issues, domestic policies that go on both in China and the United States. But if you're interested in that, I would recommend a macroeconomics class. Can really do this quite well. But, how can we see globalization? A lot of people are like, all right, you're giving me a bunch of theoretical nonsense. Tell me how I can see it. All right. Look at two of the world's, largest companies, Starbucks or McDonald's. You find these, both American corporations, across the world in a way that you would have never seen an American company or a company from any other part of the world really before, except for maybe the Dutch East India Company. Remember, we talked a little bit about the Dutch East India Company, or maybe even the East India Company of the British Isles. You could definitely recognize the Dutch East India Company if you lived, say, in the South Pacific during the 17th or 18th centuries. But not even to the extent that you would recognize Starbucks or McDonald's today. I mean, these are global entities that are recognizable across the world. What's another one? Hey, what about Disney? Take a look at this, obviously for the very popular Frozen movie. This is obviously comes from the Asian continent. Disney, an American corporation, again, has a broader economic base and popular base than just the United States. And even though a lot of these companies create a tremendous amount of wealth, you should really take a look at this slide on the PowerPoint to demonstrate how that wealth is distributed. You'll notice that 71% of the world, so almost 3/4 of the entire world's population, owns just 3% of the world's global wealth, whereas 0.7%, so less than 1% of the world's population, owns 45.2, almost half of the world's global wealth. So globalization has created tremendous wealth, right? A wealth that the world had never seen before. Keynes was right. Wealth is not stagnant. It can be created, and we've seen that. I just read the other day that Jeff Bezos, the founder and owner of Amazon, made $13 billion in 24 hours, which broke records for the amount of money earned in a single day. And just kind of demonstrates to you, this tremendous disparity of wealth that exists in the modern world and is created in a large part by globalization. That is, globalization is not a fair distribution of wealth. It creates pockets of wealth and even more pocketed individuals with wealth. And your primary source and your discussion point asks you to really kind of talk about this. You're going to notice there is no weekly response so long as everyone, there is no weekly response that requires you to kind of think about our chapter reading. It's more about the course as a whole. I'm going to be looking much more at your primary source response this week. But globalization is not only economic. It's also the spread of ideas. And the primary source you're reading today comes from the Middle East, and it comes from an area that is heavily connected with the faith of Islam. And one thing that we're noticing as kind of globalization spreads throughout the 21st century is that it's not just a redistribution of wealth or people, it's also a redistribution of ideas. And so a very Western idea is the idea of feminism. Now, it's important to note that there are many different definitions of what feminism is within this nation, within other nations, worldwide. And so, just to talk about feminism probably is doing a little bit of an injustice. And trust me, I recognize that, right? My specialty is women and gender of the 18th century British world. And so, what feminism meant, no one would have ever used that term, but what feminism meant in the 18th century is very different from what feminism meant in 1950, which is very different from what feminism meant in 1999, which is very different from what feminism means today. But if we think about feminism broadly, it's safe to say that at least in some elements of feminism, it is the understanding, right, that men and women, even though there are important, perhaps biological differences in sex, that men and women face very different realities in the world because of gender. What's the difference between sex and gender? Sex is biological, gender is a social construct. And so feminism, to give it a very basic, and don't cut my head off here because I know it's much more complex than this, but to give it a very basic definition for this class at least, is the idea that men and women should not be treated differently because of their gender. That women have for a very long time been subjugated to men because of differences in how their gender is perceived. And within the Western world, there were women who began, and men who began pushing back against this idea of the subjugation of women in pretty much the 19th and then early 20th centuries. Now, in the more modern world, globalization has taken feminist ideas and brought them to places where they had not necessarily existed before or had not existed in the same ways before. And you're going to be reading a little bit about feminism in the global context. You're going to be reading about it from the Islamic world. So I want you to just kind of pay attention, and the question asks you to talk a little bit about what feminism looks like in the Islamic world. You can read there for a little bit more. But think about the ways in which feminism pushes back against some of the subjugations women's faced in the Islamic world. So let's tie it all together, and I've got about just about 7 minutes to do it, so I'm going to move pretty quickly. But what have we learned from History 103? Well, I've got here a class summary. Week 1, we talked about empires in the Atlantic. We talked about economic transformation, cultural transformation, the age of revolutions, industrialization and Marx, industrial colonialism, the world at war, and now we end off with globalization. So where do we get? Where are we today, and how can we use any of this to our advantage? There's a lot here. Right? Within the United States, there is a far-right movement that is mirrored. So you see in the top left, the far-right movement. This comes from Charlottesville, Virginia from only a couple of years ago. And then in the bottom right, you see a refugees not welcome sign that comes from the Brexit movement in Great Britain. There are really important similarities between the far-right movement in the United States and the Brexit movement in Great Britain, which we can talk about. The bottom left, you'll notice obviously a drought scene, global warming, global climate change, really real issues that have to be discussed that will undoubtedly shape the future of global politics, global economics, global history. The top right, you have this continuing new form of industrialization that in the same way the industrialized world, the beginnings of industrialization, changed how farmers, how merchants, how peasants interacted with both their government and their economy, the continuing modification of industrialization, right? Some people say we're in a fourth wave of the Industrial Revolution where things are becoming automated. You're having machines and robots take jobs, is going to definitely affect the human condition. One thing that we should note, beginning in 2015, basically, because of the refugee crisis stemming from the Middle East and the rise of ISIS, you had a flood of migrants from this region, particularly from Syria and Iraq and even parts of southern Turkey, into the European Union. And you'll notice that certain countries, Germany here, as you can see, Hungary, France, had more immigrants than other nations. For example, Ireland or the UK didn't see nearly as many immigrants as Germany did. And what has that created? It's created xenophobia, right? There are movements within the European Union to stop the increase of migrants from the Middle East. Does that sound familiar at all? Absolutely. You can draw a direct connection between this xenophobic response to immigrants from the Middle East to a similar xenophobic response in the United States to immigrants from Latin and South America. And so what does that mean? Well, in Great Britain in particular, there's been a movement to get out of the European Union. This economic and political entity that's created so much stability in Europe, a lot of members of the United Kingdom, so that's Great Britain, so Great Britain comprises of England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, who want to leave the European Union. They say, let's get out of the European Union so we don't have to continue to have this flood of refugees. And if you think about the kind of nationalist movements that are happening in the United States and happening in the EU, right, these pushbacks against globalization, people who say, listen, globalization has gone too far. The global economic order threatens to undermine what it means to be American, or what it means to be British, or what it means to be French, right? If you pick up certain publications, you'll be reading a lot about this, that immigrants, migrants threaten the American way of life, or the French way of life, the British way of life. None of this is new. Xenophobia is very old. In the late 19th century, the United States dealt with a very similar xenophobia, except it was called Irish need not apply, or Italians need not apply. But now Irish and Italian Americans are seen as very much Americans. But there was a big xenophobic movement against them. Same in the UK. The UK for a long time looked down upon the Irish. The French looked very much down upon the Spanish. However, now the other, right, this danger has become a different group of people, these migrants from the Middle East or from Southeastern, or from Latin and South America. So why does that matter, right? Draw the connections. Take what you've learned in this class and apply it to the present day. Remember the beginning of the First World War. Nationalism was at an all-time high. And that's why this small little event, right, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in the Balkans, created a global conflict that, as we talked about last week, ultimately led to the rise of Hitler in the Second World War, genocide, the use of atomic weapons. Had nationalism not been at an all-time high in 1914, perhaps a small little event in the Balkans could have been contained to that area only and not created two world wars that were intimately connected. I would also argue that there's an extreme danger of polarization that's going on across the world today. You know, it's important, I think, for you as individuals to not just pay attention to the news in the United States, or not just pay attention to political, economic interest here in the United States. You have to think more globally, because as I'm sure you're learning, especially during a modern pandemic, the world is intimately connected across global boundaries. And so we should recognize how similarities, how xenophobic movements in Europe, and xenophobic movements that are also going on in Asia, by the way, and xenophobic movements that are going on in the Americas have a similar ideological base. You know, what's causing this base? Think about our historical connections. Think about how people across the world have dealt with xenophobia before or haven't dealt with it, and then what the consequences of that were, right? I would argue that there is an intimate connection. This image comes from Charlottesville, Virginia. Sure, are people marching with the swastika and the Confederate flag in Charlottesville, Virginia? Probably a very small minority of Americans, absolutely, but there's a danger there, because there's a similar movement going on in Europe, and we have to think about where these ideological connections come from. So in conclusion, if we look around the world today, there's a lot of problems, right? There's civil wars that threaten the stability of sub-Saharan Africa. There's climate change that's brought droughts and flooding to other regions. And despite a slowing birth rate around the world, the birth rate continues to remain most high in Africa, as we can see on this chart here. And you can see the live populations of birth mostly slowing in the rest of the world, continuing in sub-Saharan Africa, where there's also a nation being plagued by civil war. Asia, you have a continuing growth in China. And you know that if the Chinese economy falters, it's going to affect the rest of the world because of modern globalization. You also have the Chinese spending an increasing amount on their military. But notice, even though people in the U.S. love to demonize China, China still spends a quarter, not even, right, of what the U.S. spends on their military, $740 billion compared to $90 billion in China. South America is being kind of plagued by its relationship with the United States due to increasing inflation. So I want you to really take this slide and take it for what it's worth. Think about our historical connections that we've studied this year. Think about how to apply that to the modern world and the news you read. I really appreciate learning from all of you, and I hope this course has been useful.